The robbery took my wallet, but fear took my nights. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps coming back. I swallowed my pride and asked my son if I could stay with him, just until I felt safe again. But his words hit me harder than any fist. He said he didn't need another mouth to feed in his house. I said nothing, but the words stayed with me longer than any fear. When I came to visit him without a call, what I saw inside his home, it shook me harder than the robbery ever did. Before we dive in, please consider giving us a thumbs up. It had been 3 nights since my world had shrunk to the size of a deadbolt. The house, once a sanctuary filled with the warm, worn memories of my late wife, Helen, was now a prison of sound and shadow. Every familiar groan of the floorboards under my sock feet was a menacing footstep echoing in the hall. The police had been kind but brief, their questions a sterile checklist, leaving behind a case number and a profound silence that dread quickly filled. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. When it came, it brought disjointed replays of a stranger's gloved hand, smelling of cheap leather, and the cold, indifferent pressure of steel against my temple. I'd wake with my heart hammering against my ribs, the darkness in the room feeling thick and suffocating, as if it had a physical weight. During the day, I went through the motions. The coffee was bitter ash in my mouth, its warmth doing nothing to chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. The newspaper was a blur of ink. I installed a new, heavier deadbolt, the scrape of the screwdriver against brass grating in the quiet. My hands shaking as I finally got the mechanism to click shut, a fleeting illusion of control. But as dusk painted long, distorted shadows across the living room floor, the fear returned, coiling in my stomach like a cold snake. The loneliness I'd grown accustomed to since Helen passed had become a hostile, mocking presence. By the 4th night, after another stretch of hours spent staring at the ceiling, I knew I couldn't endure it alone. Pride is a stubborn thing for a man who has always been the protector. But the primal need for safety, for the simple comfort of another friendly soul breathing under the same roof, finally won. My thumb hovered over the contact name on my phone. Caleb, my son. Memories washed over me in a painful, vivid cascade. Carrying him on my shoulders through this very house, his small hands tangled in my hair, teaching him to drive on these quiet suburban streets, my own foot pressing an imaginary brake, paying his college tuition without a second thought, proud of the man he was becoming. We weren't as close anymore, a distance carved by his demanding career and his marriage to Brianna, but he was family. That had to count for something. I finally pressed the call button. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice clipped and impatient, the sound of traffic in the background. "Hey, Dad, I'm a little busy right now. What's up?" I kept my voice steady, explaining what happened, how the house felt too empty, the silence too loud. I could hear the sigh of pure exasperation on the other end of the line before I even finished asking if I could stay for just a few nights. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, filled only by the crackle of the connection. I could hear him speaking to someone else, his voice muffled but sharp, before he came back on the line, his tone now cold and detached, as if he were dealing with a minor business inconvenience. Then came the words, delivered not with anger, but with a calm, dismissive finality that was infinitely more brutal. "Look, Dad," he said, the sigh still in his voice. "I'm sorry about what happened. I really am. But Brianna and I have a lot going on with work and other commitments. I just don't need an extra mouth to feed in my house right now." The phrase hung in the air, ugly and sharp. He wasn't talking to his father. He was talking to a stray, a burden to be cast off. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He ended the call, and the screen went black, plunging me back into a silence that was now filled with the deafening echo of his words. The robbery had violated my home, but this violated my soul. The thief took my wallet. My son took my dignity. I sat in the dark, the phone clutched in my hand, a coldness spreading through me that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. The phrase, "an extra mouth to feed," played on a loop in my head, each repetition stripping away another layer of my worth. It was the kind of thing you say about an unwanted pet, not the father who raised you. Had all the years of love and support, the scraped knees mended, the homework checked, the down payment assisted, been reduced to a crude calculation of resources? The fear that had kept me awake was replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. A new feeling began to stir beneath the hurt. A sharp, burning curiosity. What commitments could be so demanding? What life had they built that was so fragile? The excuse felt thin, rehearsed. It was a dismissal, and I needed to see the truth behind it. I stood up, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the door, driven by a pain so profound it had become its own kind of purpose. The drive across town was a blur of streetlights and the warm, glowing windows of other people's homes, each one a tiny diorama of a life I suddenly felt completely disconnected from. I parked a block away from his house, a 2-story colonial I had helped him put the down payment on, a fact that now felt like a bitter joke. I didn't want to announce my arrival. I needed to see the truth, without it being filtered for my benefit. I expected to see a single light on in a study, a sign of a man buried in his important work. That would have fit his narrative. But the house was ablaze with light, every window casting a golden rectangle onto the pristine lawn. And then I heard it. Not the low hum of a television, but music, a cheerful, upbeat rhythm that seemed to mock the silence in my own home. And over the music, a wave of bright, unrestrained laughter. It wasn't the sound of two people burdened by overwhelming commitments. It was the sound of a party. My fingers closed around the cold shape of the spare key Caleb had given me years ago. He'd never bothered to change the locks. I guess he never imagined I'd use it like this. The laughter from the house washed over me, and the anger that had been a flicker now roared into a steady flame, burning away my hesitation. I walked up the stone pathway, the soles of my shoes silent on the carefully laid pavers. I slipped the key into the lock, and it still fit perfectly, the metal sliding into place with a quiet, satisfying click. I pushed the door open just enough to enter, and closed it behind me without a sound. The warmth of the house enveloped me, thick with the rich smell of roasted garlic, expensive perfume, and wine. From the foyer, partially hidden by a large, leafy plant, I had a clear view of the dining room. It wasn't a large party. It was something far more intimate and far more insulting. There were only 3 of them: Caleb, Brianna, and a young man I'd never seen before. He sat between them, a handsome man in his mid-20s with artfully messy hair and a confident smile that suggested he'd never been told no in his life. The table was laden with a feast that could have fed a dozen people. Roasted chicken glistening under the chandelier, bowls of steaming vegetables, a bottle of ridiculously expensive red wine. My son and his wife fawned over their guest, whose name I later learned was Julian. They hung on his every word, laughing with a genuine delight I hadn't seen from Caleb in years. Caleb refilled Julian's wine glass before it was half empty. Brianna fussed over him like a doting mother, placing more food on his plate. It was a theatrical performance of hospitality. Every shared glance, every burst of laughter was another twist of the knife in my gut. I was a ghost at a feast I had unwittingly sponsored, thinking of the half can of soup I'd eaten for dinner in my silent, empty house. I stood there, frozen, an intruder in a scene I had helped finance. The phrase echoed in my mind, a cruel counterpoint to the scene before me. an extra mouth to feed. They didn't have room for one more, for their own father. But they had more than enough for this stranger. Who was he to command such devotion? Then I heard Caleb raise his glass in a toast, his eyes shining with a vicarious pride. "Anything you need, Julian. You just let us know," my son said, his voice full of promise. "We believe in what you're building. We're here to help you succeed." It was so noble, so generous. It was also a complete lie, though I didn't know the full extent of it yet. It was a betrayal so profound it left no room for misunderstanding. This was a conscious choice, a declaration of their values. And I was not one of them. Carefully, silently, I backed away and slipped out into the cold night. The laughter from inside seemed to follow me, mocking my retreat. By the time I reached my car, the shock had receded, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. The pain was still there, but it was now mixed with a steely, quiet anger. I was done being the victim. The next few days passed in a fog of numb activity as I filed the police report and called my insurance company. It was during this administrative drudgery that my world tilted on its axis for a second time. I was in my study, the room smelling of dust and aging paper, searching for the insurance policy, when I pulled out the folder for the joint savings account I held with Caleb. I had added his name years ago when Helen first got sick, an act of trust. I spread the statements out on the dark wood of the desk, and then I saw it. On a statement from 6 months prior, a single line item read, "Online transfer, investment fund." The amount was $15,000. I stared at the number, my mind refusing to process it. $15,000. I had no memory of this. I hadn't made any new investments. I thought back, trying to recall authorizing such a transfer. Nothing. A cold, sickening certainty began to dawn. There was only one other person who could have made this transfer. My son. The man who didn't need another mouth to feed. The man who was too busy to help his father. The man who was bankrolling the success of a young man named Julian. This wasn't just about a lie or a cruel turn of phrase. This was something else entirely. This was theft. The word theft settled in my mind, cold and heavy. It was a word for strangers, not for my own son. But as I sat in the dusty silence of my study, the bank statement spread before me like an indictment. I could find no other word that fit. The grief and anger coalesced into a single, sharp point of focus. This was no longer just a family drama. It was a crime. The fear that had haunted my nights was gone, burned away by the cold fire of this new purpose. My mission was no longer to find comfort. It was to find the truth. I was no longer a frightened old man. I was an investigator. I pulled out every statement from the last 2 years, laying them out in chronological order across my desk. The only light came from my desk lamp, a small, intense circle that turned the stack of papers into my entire world, the rest of the room fading into shadow. With a yellow highlighter, I began to mark every transfer I didn't recognize, the squeak of the marker against the paper the only sound in the room. The $15,000 withdrawal was just the beginning. Before that, $5,000. Before that, a staggering $20,000. The list grew, a sickening chronicle of my trust being systematically drained. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, my desk looked like a crime scene. I had counted 6 unauthorized transfers over 18 months, totaling more than $75,000. The money I had worked my entire life to save had been pilfered. I leaned back in my chair, the springs groaning, rubbing my tired eyes. The scale of the deception was hard to comprehend. I remembered when I'd added Caleb to the account. He'd seemed hesitant, almost guilty when signing the papers. At the time, I'd thought it was just him being emotional about Helen's illness. Now it looked like premeditation. I knew I couldn't confront him directly. He would lie. Brianna would lie. They would twist the story, make me seem confused and senile. I needed more than just a list of transactions. I needed to know where the money went. I called my old friend, a retired accountant, and framed it as a financial puzzle I needed help understanding. We met at a quiet diner, the air thick with the smell of bacon and stale coffee. I laid a few of the statements on the cracked vinyl of the table, the highlighted lines looking obscene in the bright morning light. He put on his reading glasses, his brow furrowed. He confirmed my fears, explaining how easy it was for someone with joint access to move money around, digitally. He gave me some practical advice, but then he said something that changed everything. He leaned back, shaking his head. "It's a shame," he said. "You see this kind of thing more and more these days, especially with these online charities." The word hung in the air. Charity. It connected a series of seemingly unrelated dots. Caleb's excuse on the phone. Other commitments. Brianna's performance at the farmer's market would later reinforce this. I left the diner with a new, terrifying hypothesis. My son and his wife weren't just thieves. They were con artists. When I got home, I went straight to my computer. Their public social media profiles appeared instantly, a curated gallery of their perfect life. There were pictures of them at elegant parties, on exotic vacations, and woven throughout, posts about their supposed charity work. It was a masterpiece of public relations, a fantasy built with my life savings. I scrolled deeper, my anger growing. I found their posts about Julian, their protégé, describing him as a once-in-a-generation talent. The final piece clicked into place when I found a link in Brianna's profile for the Community Arts Fund. The website was sleek, professional, and featured a prominent Donate Now button on every page. I felt a wave of nausea. This was where my money had gone, funneled from my savings, through this digital facade and into their pockets. They had stolen from me, and then had the audacity to congratulate themselves for their generosity. I was about to close the browser when a small link at the bottom of the page caught my eye. In the news. I clicked it. The page that loaded was an article from a local online news blog published just last week. The headline read, "Local couple honored for philanthropic efforts." And beneath it was a large professional photograph of Caleb and Brianna, beaming. The article announced that, in recognition of their outstanding contributions, they would be the guests of honor at the upcoming annual Unity Foundation Charity Gala in 2 weeks' time, where they would be presented with the Philanthropist of the Year award. I stared at the screen. They had given me the perfect stage. They had built the platform from which they would fall. The 2 weeks leading up to the gala were a countdown to the justice I intended to deliver. My anger was no longer a hot rage, but a cold, focused energy. I spent my days methodically building my case, my dining room table, a makeshift command center. I printed everything, the sharp smell of printer ink filling the air. I drew red lines connecting a withdrawal from my account to a photograph of them on a beach in the Caribbean, or a picture of Julian with a new, expensive watch. I was the architect of their downfall, and I would not overlook a single detail. I knew I needed to test them first, to see how they would react under public pressure. Brianna's social media provided the opportunity. She would be running a booth for the Community Arts Fund at the local farmers market that Saturday. It was the perfect low-stakes environment for my first move. That Saturday, the farmers market was a vibrant chaos of sights and smells, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread, damp earth, and grilling corn. I spotted their booth from a distance, professionally done with a crisp banner and tasteful pamphlets. Brianna was there, a picture of charitable grace, with Caleb beside her playing the part of the supportive husband. They were a brand, selling a story of compassion. I watched them hand out free cookies, accept small donations with effusive thanks, and speak with practiced sincerity. They were so good at it. For a moment, I almost faltered. But then I thought of the highlighted bank statements, of the cold dismissal in my son's voice. This entire charade was funded by my life's work. The thought gave me the strength to walk forward. My approach was quiet. I let them see me coming, let the recognition dawn on their faces. Brianna's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before it was plastered back in place. Caleb's face went pale. I ignored my daughter-in-law and addressed my son directly, my voice calm and even, loud enough for the couple at the adjacent honey stand to hear. "Caleb," I began, keeping my tone conversational. "I was looking at our joint savings account. Can you remind me what that $15,000 withdrawal back in May was for?" The effect was immediate. He looked at Brianna, his eyes wide with panic. The friendly facade had shattered. Brianna, however, was a professional. She recovered instantly, stepping between us. She placed a hand on my arm. Her touch meant to look comforting, but feeling like a vice. Her face was a mask of deep, loving concern, but I saw her knuckles turn white as her fingers tightened on a stack of pamphlets. "Oh, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your memory isn't what it used to be. We talked about this, remember? It was for a very important donation to help a young artist get back on his feet. You were so happy to help." She patted my arm, a gesture of dismissal disguised as affection. She had, in a few short sentences, reframed the situation. I was no longer a concerned father. I was a confused, forgetful old man. The couple at the honey stand looked at me with pity. I didn't argue. I had gotten what I came for. I had seen how they operated. Caleb was the weak link. Brianna was the enforcer. I simply nodded slowly, then turned and walked away, the whispers of the crowd following me. The humiliation was a small price to pay for the intelligence I had just gathered. As I was making my way through the crowd, a hand gently touched my elbow. I turned and was met with the sharp, intelligent eyes of my neighbor, Eliza. She was a retired schoolteacher who had lived across the street from me for 20 years. She held a small bag of tomatoes, but her focus was entirely on me. Her expression was not one of pity, but of shrewd assessment. She had seen the entire exchange, and unlike the others, she hadn't bought the performance. She gestured with her head towards a quieter spot. "Arthur, I saw that," she said, her voice low. It didn't look right. I just nodded, overwhelmed by the simple relief of being believed. "I don't mean to pry," she continued, "but my nephew is a cybersecurity analyst. He's one of those computer wizards. Maybe he can find out where that donation of yours really went." Her offer was a lifeline. I had the financial records. I had a public stage. And now I had the potential for the final, undeniable proof I needed. The response from the Unity Foundation came less than 24 hours later. A single-line email that simply read, "We would like to discuss your concerns. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. The brevity spoke volumes. They were taking this seriously enough to move quickly, but carefully enough not to commit anything to writing. I spent that sleepless night arranging my evidence one final time, checking and rechecking every document, every timestamp, every piece of the puzzle that would expose my son's betrayal. 2 days later, I sat in a sterile conference room on the 14th floor of a glass tower downtown. The room was designed to intimidate with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, its polished mahogany table that reflected faces like a dark mirror, its leather chairs that seemed to swallow anyone who sat in them. The air conditioning was set too cold, making the space feel like a corporate morgue where reputations went to die. The Foundation's executive director sat across from me, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it stretched her features into an expression of permanent skepticism. She wore a charcoal suit that matched the storm clouds gathering outside the windows, and her hands rested on a legal pad where she had yet to write a single word. 2 other Foundation board members flanked her, their faces carefully neutral, trained in the art of revealing nothing while absorbing everything. I laid out my entire arsenal with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting to a jury. First came the bank statements, 23 pages showing every withdrawal from Helen's accounts over the past 18 months. I had highlighted the relevant transactions in a yellow marker that glowed like accusations under the fluorescent lights. Next came the printouts from social media, Julian's Instagram and Facebook posts, arranged chronologically to correspond with each withdrawal. The correlation was undeniable. Each theft followed within days by evidence of luxury spending. Finally, I placed the flash drive in the center of the polished table. The small device containing the audio recordings and additional digital evidence. It sat there like a tiny bomb, black plastic against dark wood, holding enough explosive power to destroy 2 careers and a carefully constructed social facade. "This flash drive," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "contains recordings of conversations where my son discusses the movement of funds. Not all of them are explicit admissions, but taken together with the financial evidence, they paint a clear picture." I told her the entire story from beginning to end, my voice even and controlled, presenting facts rather than emotions. I explained how the thefts had begun small, testing the waters, then escalated as they realized how easy it was to steal from an elderly woman who trusted them completely. I described discovering the fake charity, the private account in Brianna's name, the systematic deception that had required planning and coordination. The executive director listened without interruption, her face an unreadable mask carved from professional neutrality. Occasionally she would lean forward to examine a particular document more closely, her reading glasses catching the light as she traced columns of numbers with one manicured finger. She studied the Instagram posts with particular interest, lingering on the photo of Julian's Rolex, comparing the date to the corresponding bank withdrawal. When I finished, the silence in the room was so complete, I could hear the whisper of air through the vents and the distant sound of traffic 14 floors below. She picked up the flash drive, turning it over in her fingers as if weighing its contents physically as well as morally. The 2 board members exchanged glances that seemed to contain entire conversations in microseconds of eye contact. "Mr. Chen," she finally said, using my fake name without hesitation, though I suspected she knew exactly who I really was. "The Unity Foundation takes allegations of this nature extremely seriously. Fraud committed by honorees reflects on our judgment and damages our credibility with donors." She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone navigating a minefield. "We will conduct our own review of this evidence. Our forensic accountants will verify the financial trail. Our legal team will assess the implications. This process will be thorough but quick. The gala is in 3 days." She made no promises about what would happen, offered no sympathy for my situation or condemnation of my son. She was a professional protecting her organization's reputation, nothing more or less. But as I stood to leave, gathering my copies of the documents while leaving the originals with her, she gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the smallest of gestures, a movement that could have been dismissing a stray thought, but I understood its meaning. The trap was set, the machinery of institutional justice beginning to turn. The 3 days before the gala passed in a blur of preparation and dread. I knew that once the truth was revealed, there would be no going back. The relationship with my son, already strained to breaking, would shatter completely. But the alternative was allowing them to continue stealing. Not just money, but trust. From an organization that helped real families in crisis. On the night of the gala, I dressed with deliberate care in the dark charcoal suit I had bought for Helen's funeral 6 months earlier. The fabric still smelled faintly of the funeral home's lilies, a ghost of grief that seemed appropriate for what was about to happen. I adjusted my tie in the mirror, noting how much older I looked since this all began, the lines around my eyes deeper, the gray in my hair more pronounced. This crusade for justice had aged me in ways that time alone couldn't account for. The Grand Belmore Hotel rose like a golden monument to excess in the heart of downtown, its Art Deco facade illuminated by spotlights that turned the building into a beacon visible for miles. Valets in red jackets scrambled to park luxury cars that arrived in a steady stream, each one disgorging guests dressed in their charity finest. I handed my keys to a young man who looked at my modest sedan with polite disinterest, then walked through the massive brass doors into another world. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and evening gowns, a carefully choreographed display of wealth pretending to care about poverty. Crystal chandeliers cast fragments of light across the crowd, like scattered diamonds, and the air hummed with polite conversation punctuated by the delicate clinking of champagne glasses. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with the arrangements of white orchids on every table, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously intoxicating and suffocating. I saw them immediately from across the room, as if some magnetic force drew my eyes to them. Caleb and Brianna were indeed the stars of the show, holding court near the silent auction tables where people bid absurd amounts for vacation packages and signed memorabilia. They were radiant in their confidence, my son in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Brianna, in an emerald evening gown that caught the light with every movement. They moved through the crowd like royalty greeting subjects, shaking hands with the mayor and his wife, posing for photographs with major donors, their smiles never wavering. They were at the absolute pinnacle of their social climbing, bathed in the warm glow of public adoration, completely unaware that the foundation they stood on was about to crumble into dust. Every laugh, every gesture, every moment of their triumph was unknowingly their last. I found my assigned table in a discreet corner, deliberately placed where I could observe without being observed. The foundation had seated me with other minor donors, people whose contributions didn't warrant proximity to the head table, where my son would soon be honored. It was a perfect vantage point for what was to come. Eliza was already there when I arrived, a pillar of quiet support in a simple navy dress that stood out among the peacocking gowns around us. She rose when she saw me, squeezing my hand briefly in a gesture that conveyed more than words could. We didn't need to speak about what was coming. Her presence was enough, a reminder that someone else knew the truth and supported what I was about to do. The others at our table made polite small talk that I barely heard, my attention focused entirely on watching my son and his wife work the room. They had perfected the art of charity theater, touching shoulders, remembering names, making each person feel like they were the most important donor in the room. Brianna had a particular talent for it, tilting her head just so when listening, laughing at the right moments, creating an aura of warmth that was entirely manufactured. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, their music providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the evening's performance. Waiters in white jackets circulated with trays of champagne and canapes that looked like tiny works of art. Everything was designed to make the wealthy feel good about giving money, to transform charity into entertainment. Dinner was served with military precision, 5 courses that I barely touched. The salmon was perfectly cooked, but tasted like ash in my mouth. The wine was undoubtedly expensive, but might as well have been water. All I could focus on was the program sitting beside my plate. The schedule that showed recognition of honorees would happen immediately after dessert. Around me, Conversation flowed about property values and vacation homes, about children's achievements and stock portfolios. These people had so much wealth they could give it away for social status, while my son had stolen from someone who had nothing left to give. The irony was sharp enough to cut. As dessert was cleared and coffee served, I watched the executive director rise from the head table and make her way to the podium. She moved with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times, who knew how to command a room full of egos and alcohol. She tapped the microphone once, the sound cutting through conversations like a knife. "Good evening, distinguished guests," she began, her voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sound system. "Tonight we celebrate not just generosity, but transformation. The transformation of resources into hope, of privilege into purpose." She spoke eloquently about the Foundation's mission, about the families they'd helped, the lives they'd changed. Statistics were woven into stories, making numbers human. She was building to something, creating a context that would make what was coming even more devastating. "But tonight," she continued, "we particularly want to honor two individuals who have gone above and beyond in their commitment to our cause." She paused, letting anticipation build. Caleb and Brianna Chen have not just given money. They've given their time, their energy, their passion to helping those less fortunate. Her praise was effusive, painting them as saints of the community, paragons of young philanthropy. She listed their supposed contributions, the committees they'd joined, the events they'd hosted. Each word was another brick in the monument she was building, a monument that would soon come crashing down. As she spoke, her eyes scanned the room and found mine across the sea of tables. She gave me that same subtle nod from our meeting, so small that no one else would notice. The show was about to begin. My heart rate accelerated despite my attempts to remain calm. This was the point of no return. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "please join me in welcoming our honorees of the evening, Caleb and Brianna Chen." A wave of thunderous applause filled the room as my son and his wife made their way to the stage. They climbed the steps with practiced grace, Brianna lifting her gown slightly to navigate in her heels, Caleb offering his arm with choreographed chivalry. They accepted the heavy crystal award from the director, holding it up for the crowd as they received a standing ovation. The crystal caught the light, sending rainbow patterns across their faces, a beautiful illusion about to shatter. Brianna stepped to the microphone, her eyes glistening with what appeared to be genuine emotion. Her voice was smooth and practiced as she spoke of their passion for helping those less fortunate, of the importance of opening your heart and your home to those in need. The irony of her words, knowing what they'd done to Helen, made my stomach turn. "We believe," she said, her voice catching slightly in a performance of humility, "that those of us who have been blessed have a duty to lift others up. It's not just about writing checks. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, about recognizing that we're all family." It was a masterful performance, hitting every note perfectly. People around me were nodding, some wiping tears, completely taken in by the show. She spoke of specific families they'd supposedly helped, though I wondered if those families even existed, or were just more fiction in their elaborate construct of lies. As her final words echoed through the ballroom, the applause began to build once more. People rose to their feet again, champagne glasses raised in toast. It should have been their moment of ultimate triumph. Instead, it became something else entirely. Behind them, the massive projection screen that had been displaying the Foundation's logo throughout the evening flickered suddenly. The crowd expected a tribute video, perhaps footage of my son and daughter-in-law at charity events, testimonials from grateful families. The executive director had assured me her technical crew would handle the switch at precisely the right moment. They had outdone themselves. The screen lit up not with a video, but with a single, stark image that seemed to burn through the darkness. My bank statement, Helen's bank statement. The $15,000 withdrawal, highlighted in a brutal yellow marker that seemed to glow like fire. The image was massive, impossible to ignore or misunderstand. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd like the first tremor before an earthquake. People stopped clapping, glasses lowered, heads turning to look at the screen in confusion. Before the murmur could grow into questions, the image changed to a split screen that told a story without words. The bank statement on the left, Julian's Instagram post from Tuscany on the right, a photograph of him raising a glass of wine in front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The dates were circled in accusatory red, the correlation impossible to deny. The murmuring grew louder, taking on a different quality now. No longer confusion but understanding, the crowd began to piece together what they were seeing. On stage, Caleb and Brianna had turned to look at the screen, their faces beginning the transition from triumph to horror. The slides changed more quickly now, a relentless presentation of evidence that built like a prosecutorial case. Each frame was another nail in the coffin of their reputation. A withdrawal matched with a photo of Julian's new sports car, the silver Mercedes gleaming in afternoon sunlight. Another withdrawal next to a close-up of his Rolex, Julian's wrist extended to show off the watch that cost more than many people's annual salaries. The crowd had gone silent now, except for isolated gasps as each new piece of evidence appeared. The slide showing the Community Arts Fund website was particularly damaging, the amateurish design obvious even from a distance. This was followed immediately by a bold red, "No record found," from the official IRS database of registered charities. The fake charity was exposed for everyone to see. A collective gasp went through the room, the sound of 300 people simultaneously understanding they were witnessing a crime being exposed in real time. On stage, Brianna had gone pale beneath her makeup, her hand pressed to her chest as if trying to hold her heart in place. Caleb stood frozen, the crystal award still clutched in his hands like a shield that offered no protection. Then came the final piece of financial evidence, perhaps the most damning of all, a screenshot of the private bank account in the name of Brianna Miller, her maiden name. The balance was displayed clearly, showing hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been siphoned from Helen's trust. The account activity showed deposits that matched, dollar for dollar, the withdrawals from Helen's accounts. The room had gone completely silent now, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, frozen in place as they watched the spectacular destruction of two reputations. Then, cutting through that silence like a blade, my son's voice filled the room. It was an audio recording from 3 weeks ago, one where Julian had been discussing the fund transfers with someone on the phone, not knowing that call was being recorded. His voice was casual, dismissive, as he inadvertently admitted to moving the funds for what he called a private arts venture. He laughed at one point, saying, "It's not like she understands what's happening anyway." The words echoed through the ballroom, bouncing off the walls, impossible to deny or retract. Caleb staggered back on the stage, his face the color of ash, gray and lifeless. The award slipped from his fingers, hitting the stage with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The crystal shattered, sending pieces skittering across the polished floor, each fragment catching the light as it spun. Brianna stood frozen like a statue, her perfect mask not just slipping, but completely obliterated. Her mouth opened and closed without sound, her carefully constructed persona crumbling in real time before hundreds of witnesses. The emerald gown that had made her look regal now seemed like costume jewelry, fake and gaudy under the harsh reality of exposure. The audio ended, leaving behind a silence that was somehow even more terrible than the recording. The screen went black for a moment, just long enough for people to think it might be over. Then it lit up one final time with 5 words in enormous white letters that seemed to burn themselves into everyone's retinas. "I don't need an extra mouth to feed." The quote was unattributed, but it didn't need to be. Everyone understood whose words these were, spoken about the old woman they'd been stealing from. It was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, showing not just financial crime, but a deeper, personal cruelty that made the thefts even more abhorrent. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a vacuum where sound used to exist. Everyone stared at the stage, their faces displaying a mixture of shock, disgust, and the kind of morbid fascination that makes people slow down at accident scenes. They were witnessing the spectacular, real-time implosion of 2 people they had been honoring as heroes just moments before. Caleb and Brianna stood trapped in the glare of the stage lights like deer frozen in headlights. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The spotlight that had been their moment of glory had become their pillory. Brianna looked like she was about to collapse, her legs visibly shaking, one hand gripping the podium for support. But Caleb's shock was transforming into something else, curdling into pure, undiluted rage. His face flushed red, then purple, veins standing out on his neck as his body tensed with fury. His eyes, wild and panicked, scanned the sea of faces before him, searching for the source of his destruction. He was looking for someone to blame, someone to attack, someone to punish for this exposure. And then, across that vast, silent ballroom, his gaze found mine. The recognition was instant and electric. He knew. Even from 50 feet away, even with hundreds of people between us, he knew exactly who had orchestrated this downfall. Our eyes locked, father and son, betrayed and betrayed, and in that moment, all pretense fell away. He took a single, menacing step toward the edge of the stage, his body coiled like a snake about to strike. His hands clenched into fists, and I could see him calculating whether he could reach me through the crowd, whether violence could somehow undo what had just happened. The crowd seemed to sense the danger, people near the stage stepping back instinctively. Security guards were already moving, converging on the stage from multiple directions. The executive director was speaking urgently into her phone, probably calling the police. But Caleb's focus was entirely on me, his rage so pure it seemed to distort the air around him. "You," he mouthed across the distance, the word visible even if not audible. "You did this." And I simply nodded. The abandoned casino squatted on the edge of Nassau like a concrete skeleton, its empty windows staring blindly at the Caribbean moon. I approached through the overgrown parking lot where weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt, creating a maze of shadows in the silver light. The building had been closed for a decade after a hurricane tore off half the roof, leaving it to rot in the tropical humidity. Now it served as a meeting place for people who preferred darkness to daylight, silence to witnesses. I entered through a side door that hung off its hinges, the metal groaning as I pushed it open. The sound echoed through empty corridors, bouncing off walls covered in graffiti and mold. My feet crunched on debris that littered the floor like broken promises, a mixture of glass, concrete chips, and the detritus of homeless camps that had come and gone. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, underlaid with something else, the lingering scent of old cigarette smoke and human desperation that seemed to have soaked into the walls themselves. The main casino floor opened before me through a doorway that had once held velvet ropes and security guards. Now it was just an arch of darkness leading into a vast space filled with shadows and the ghost of desperate hope. The ceiling stretched up 3 stories, with holes where rain had found its way through, creating puddles that reflected the moonlight like mirrors. Concrete pillars rose from the floor at regular intervals, their surfaces tagged with spray paint that had faded to illegibility. I could hear voices ahead, muffled by distance, and the strange acoustics of the empty space. The casino had been designed to trap sound, to keep the noise of slot machines and celebrations contained, but now it created an echo chamber where whispers could carry farther than shouts. I moved carefully, testing each step before committing my weight, aware that any sound could announce my presence. The pillars created natural hiding spots, and I positioned myself behind one that was wide enough to conceal my body completely. From there, I had a clear view of the meeting area where 5 figures stood around a folding table that looked absurdly small in the vast space. They had lit the area with battery-powered lanterns, creating a bubble of orange light in the darkness. The light painted their faces in harsh shadows, turning familiar features into something theatrical and strange. Garrett looked older in that unforgiving light, stress having carved lines into his face that hadn't been there 6 months ago. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and he kept rubbing his face with both hands, a nervous gesture from childhood that appeared whenever he'd been caught in a lie. He was wearing jeans and a wrinkled shirt, instead of his usual business attire, as if he'd already shed his old identity in preparation for a new one. Every few seconds, he would glance toward the exits, then back at the table, like an animal aware it was in a trap, but unsure which direction offered escape. Vaughn stood slightly apart from the group, his body swaying almost imperceptibly, though whether from alcohol or anxiety, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. His clothes were rumpled, and even from my distance I could see the tremor in his hands as he lit another cigarette. The smoke rose in a thin column, dispersing into the darkness above. He looked like a man at the end of his rope, which wasn't far from the truth given what he owed to people who collected debts in blood. The 2 document forgers were bent over the table, examining something under a magnifying glass with LED lights. They were professionals. That much was clear from their methodical movements and the specialized equipment they'd brought. One was tall and thin, wearing latex gloves as he handled what looked like passports. The other was shorter, stockier, with a briefcase at his feet that probably contained the tools of their illegal trade. They worked in silence, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested long partnership. And in the center of it all, like a conductor preparing her orchestra for the final movement, stood Meredith. She was dressed simply but expensively, in dark clothes that would blend into any crowd, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even in the harsh lantern light, she was beautiful, but it was a cold beauty, calculated and purposeful. She moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again, gesturing at the documents spread on the table while speaking in a voice that carried authority. I couldn't make out all the words from my position, but the tone was unmistakable, commanding, certain. This was her show, and everyone else was just playing supporting roles. She pointed out details on the documents to Garrett, who nodded like an eager student trying to impress a teacher. She showed him signatures, stamps, explaining something that made him lean closer, hanging on every word. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the dynamics clearly. She was in charge. The men were just instruments in her symphony of theft. Then something unexpected happened that changed the entire energy of the meeting. Vaughn stepped back from the table suddenly, shaking his head in sharp, decisive movements. His body language screamed refusal, arms crossed, shoulders squared in defiance. Whatever they were discussing, he wanted no part of it. Meredith turned to him slowly, and even in the poor light I could see her expression harden from charming to dangerous in an instant. "You agreed to this?" Her voice carried clearly now, sharp with irritation. "It's too late for cold feet." Garrett looked confused, his head swiveling between them like a spectator at a tennis match who didn't understand the rules. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The comfortable script he'd been following had suddenly gone off track, and he didn't know his lines anymore. The 2 forgers exchanged glances over their work, a silent communication between partners who had learned to read trouble coming. The The taller one started carefully packing documents back into protective sleeves, while the shorter one closed his briefcase with quiet clicks. Whatever deal they'd been making was falling apart, and they wanted their merchandise secured before things got worse. The argument escalated quickly, voices rising in the echo chamber of the casino. Vaughn's words became clearer as his volume increased, fragments reaching me like shrapnel. "Not what we agreed," bounced off the ceiling. "Too much," ricocheted from pillar to pillar. "Can't do this to him," hung in the air like an accusation. "He's a mark." Meredith's response was sharp and cutting. "Just like you were, just like they all are. Don't develop a conscience now when we're this close." The words hit Garrett like physical blows. I watched him process what she'd said, understanding dawning on his face in horrible slow motion. He'd thought he was her partner, maybe even her lover. The realization that he was just another victim, another wallet to empty, seemed to age him 10 years in 10 seconds. "You said you loved me," he said, his voice small and broken, barely carrying across the space. Meredith laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I say a lot of things. You believed what you wanted to believe. That's what marks do." Garrett lunged forward then, not at her but at Vaughn, grabbing his shirt. "You knew? You brought her to me knowing what she was?" Vaughn tried to pull away, but Garrett's grip was desperate. "I didn't know everything. She told me she could help us both. I was desperate, man. You know what I owed." They struggled, two men drowning and trying to use each other as life rafts. Garrett pushed Vaughn hard enough to make him stumble backward into the table. The lanterns wobbled, sending shadows dancing crazily across the walls. The sound of Garrett's surprise and anger echoed in the empty casino, and suddenly everyone was shouting at once. That's when Delilah made her move, and it was a mistake. She shifted position to get a better angle for recording on her phone, moving from behind one pillar to another. The movement was subtle, but the shorter forger had been watching the shadows, professional paranoia that had probably kept him out of prison. He shouted and pointed directly at her hiding spot. "Someone's here! We're being watched!" Chaos erupted instantly. Garrett's head snapped toward where Delilah was hidden, and his face went from confused to furious in an instant. He started running toward her, whether to grab her phone or just to confront whoever was spying. Vaughn tried to stop him, grabbing his arm, but Garrett shook him off with desperate strength. Meredith was screaming at both of them, her controlled facade finally cracking. The forgers grabbed their equipment and ran for the nearest exit, their feet pounding on the concrete as they fled. I knew my moment had come. There was no point in hiding anymore. I stepped out from behind the pillar, moving into the light with deliberate calm. My sudden appearance in the main exit stopped everyone cold, like someone had hit pause on a video. Garrett froze mid-stride, one foot still raised, his face going white as paper. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, gasping for words that wouldn't come. The man who had stolen from me, who had betrayed 20 years of trust, suddenly looked like the scared boy who used to have nightmares and crawl into our bed. Vaughn actually stumbled backward, his legs giving out until he caught himself on the table. His cigarette fell from nerveless fingers, sending up tiny sparks as it hit the wet concrete. He looked between Garrett and me, understanding finally how completely they'd been outmaneuvered. But Meredith just smiled, that same confident expression she'd worn in every photo the investigator had found. She smoothed her hair back with one hand, a gesture so casual it was insulting, as if she'd been expecting this all along, as if I was just another complication to be managed, another obstacle to charm or threaten into submission. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice warm honey over broken glass. "I was wondering when you'd join us." The casual use of my name, the complete lack of surprise or fear, sent a chill through me. She'd known I was coming. Maybe she'd planned for it, had contingencies in place. I pulled out my phone slowly, making sure everyone could see the screen as I showed them the banking app. $5 million, I said, my voice echoing in the vast space. "The transfer you've been waiting for." I watched their eyes fix on the screen, saw the hunger in Meredith's face, the desperate hope in Garrett's, the resignation in Vaughn's. The pending transfer was there, all those zeros lined up like soldiers. But the destination had changed. Instead of their Bahamas account, it now showed the name of a children's charity, my wife's favorite, the one she had volunteered for during her final year. My friend in Nassau did more than delay the transfer, I continued, watching understanding dawn on their faces. He redirected it. The money's already gone. It cleared 10 minutes ago. The silence that followed was beautiful and terrible. $5 million, their escape fund, their new life, their freedom from consequences, evaporated into charity in the span of heartbeats. They understood at that moment that their plan had failed completely. The money was gone, beyond their reach forever, already being processed into scholarships and medical care for children who needed it more than these thieves needed to escape. Their new identities, whatever the forgers had been preparing, were useless without funds to support them. New names meant nothing if you couldn't afford the plane ticket to use them. The forgers had fled with their documents but without payment, probably already destroying evidence of this meeting. My son and his accomplices were trapped on an island with no escape route. Their paradise turned to purgatory in the span of seconds. Even Meredith's smile faltered, uncertainty creeping into her eyes for the first time. The perfect con artist had been out-conned, and the realization was dawning that she'd underestimated the mark. But she recovered quickly, reaching into her designer purse with the smooth motion of someone who'd practiced the gesture 1,000 times. The gun appeared in her hand like a magic trick, small and silver and perfectly steady. She didn't point it at me immediately, just held it at her side, a threat waiting to bloom. The metal caught the lantern light, sending reflections dancing across the ceiling. "I've done this 3 times before," she said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "Dallas, Phoenix, Seattle. Each time the family let me walk, rather than face scandal. You're going to do the same." The casualness of her confession, the matter-of-fact admission to serial fraud, made something clear. She wasn't bluffing. She'd threatened people before, had probably used that gun to ensure silence. But I'd faced armed enemies in combat zones where the bullets were real and the intentions lethal. A con artist with a weapon was just another problem to solve. "Meredith," Garrett said, taking a step toward her. The confusion and betrayal on his face mixed like oil and water, creating something toxic. "Put the gun down. This is insane." She swung the gun toward him without hesitation, and he froze instantly. The woman he thought loved him was perfectly willing to shoot him if necessary. The realization broke something in him that I could see happen in real time, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Love turned to understanding. Understanding to horror. He'd been nothing to her but a walking bank account, and now that the account was empty, he was just an obstacle to her escape. That's when we heard the sirens. The confrontation I had braced myself for never came. Before Caleb could take another step, 2 uniformed security guards moved towards the stage with a calm, practiced efficiency. The executive director spoke into the microphone, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, announcing that the award was being rescinded pending a full investigation. It was a clean, surgical removal. No shouting, no altercation. Just the quiet, humiliating spectacle of my son and his wife being escorted off the stage. Their moment of glory transformed into a walk of shame. I did not feel a surge of triumph. I just felt a profound, aching emptiness. I had won, but the price had been the final, irrevocable destruction of my own family. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The story was the talk of the town for weeks. I heard that Caleb was fired, and they sold their large colonial house in a hurry and moved away. I don't know where they went. Julian vanished from the internet overnight. The legal proceedings were a quiet, off-screen affair of paperwork and lawyers that I had no interest in following. I had my justice, as public and complete as I had planned. But the victory felt hollow. the silence in my house more profound than ever. The house itself had become a mausoleum of painful memories. I knew I couldn't heal there. About a month after the gala, I put it on the market. I packed up 40 years of my life into cardboard boxes, a painful but necessary amputation. I was cutting away the past so that I could have a future. I found a small apartment in a quiet town an hour away, a place with no history, no ghosts. It's simple, clean, and filled with light, with a small balcony that overlooks a park. The fear that had been my constant companion is gone, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. I still have trouble sleeping sometimes, but it is the gentle insomnia of an old man, not the frantic terror of a victim. The locks on my door are simple, and I no longer feel the need to check them 3 times. I am safe, not because of a deadbolt, but because I have finally set a boundary, a line that no one, not even my own blood, can cross again. This evening, Eliza came to visit. We are sitting in my small kitchen, the air filled with the comfortable aroma of simmering tomato sauce. I am making spaghetti, a simple meal made with care. As I stir the sauce, I look at her sitting at my small table, her face warm in the late afternoon light, and a feeling of contentment settles over me. There is no performance here, no need to impress, just the quiet, easy company of a friend. I spoon the pasta onto 2 plates and set one down in front of her. I watch her take the first bite, a small, genuine smile on her face. This, I think to myself, this nourishes the soul. What would you have done if you were in my place? Is public exposure the right form of justice, or is there a line that family, no matter how broken, should never cross? Please share your thoughts below, and thank you for following my story.